Thank you, Madam President. I'm rising today to spend a few minutes here on the Senate floor to talk about home, to talk about Alaska. We have a tendency, I think, sometimes up north to do things in a big way, a bold way. We tend to brag a little bit about it, and that's all okay. But we have been in the center of the news cycle for a few weeks this winter, at the onset of this year, because of our weather, which has been really big and really bold. And as a consequence of some of the extremes that we're seeing up north, it has brought out, I think, the best of Alaskans. Certainly the warmth that comes from a northern climate. I think you see that yourself coming from a state where you have some conditions with snow and cold, but the neighbor-to-neighbor response that comes about when we're dealing with Mother Nature at her finest or at her most extreme, I think it is something that really does help define us as a people. And today I want to speak for a few moments to recognize the very extraordinary efforts that we have seen recently of the United States Coast Guard and the Alaska National Guard in helping the residents of several of our communities, again, since early this year. Earlier on the floor, my colleague, the junior senator from Alaska, mentioned some of the events that have happened, and he too acknowledged the hard work and the very significant efforts of our Coast Guard and the Alaska National Guard. But I think it is important to make sure that we all take the time to tell the story, to share it with our colleagues, and to share it with people around the country. I know that in many parts of the United States right now, there are some areas that are just begging for snow. I've got sons that are out in Colorado, and they're waiting, and I know here on the East Coast, many of us would prefer a little bit more snow, but sometimes it's one of those, be careful what you ask for, or you may be like the community of Valdez and have 27 feet in your community. That's a little bit more than I think most of us would ask for or hope for. The community of Nome has been in the news for months now, as they have felt the brunt of some early winter storms, and storms that have forced them as a community in a northwestern region of our state to really feel the pinch of Mother Nature here in a very extreme way. Nome is a community of about 3,500 residents, sits up on the west coast of Alaska. Most people in this country remember or recall Nome from early days of gold rush, but more recently, Nome comes into the national news every March when the infamous or the famous Iditarod sled dog race is run, with the finish there in Nome, an 1,100-mile race where man and animal are really pitched against Mother Nature in a pretty intense way. But Nome makes it in the headlines for several different reasons. Well, this year adds yet another reason where Nome is in the history books, where people are talking about this incredible part of the state. Alaska is known for our tough winters. And again, I started off my comments by saying, you know, we kind of like the fact that we're tougher than the rest of the world, and we brag about it. But this winter has been particularly harsh. We've seen record colds, we've seen snowstorms hit the state earlier than usual. I was up in the state last week. Places like Bethel, which normally average about just about zero this time of year, we're looking at 20 below for extended periods of time, not just for a day or two, but for extended periods of time. Down in southeastern Alaska, not only have they been hit with below zero temperatures, but massive amounts of snow hitting them as well. Nome is again, it's a coastal community, and they receive their annual fuel supplies in they basically fuel up for the winter. The only way to get to Nome is to fly in or to go around the water there. And so in order to get the fuel tanks filled up for the winter, the annual fuel barges come in and have to do this in early fall before you have ice conditions out in the Bering Sea. This year, if you'll recall, back in October, everyone was watching the news because of the massive storms that were pounding western Alaska. And back here in Washington, D.C., every evening on the news, you could see these major storms coming through. If we were back here or down in Florida, they would have called them then hurricane force winds, but for us, it was a winter storm. But it was a tough winter storm, and what happened with that storm is it prevented the fuel barge from reaching Nome, so the shipment of fuel that they would receive for the winter is not able to come in. Now you might think, well, fuel up the community another way. Well, again, there are no roads. What's the other way? The other way is aircraft. So you would have to fly in barrels of fuel, driving the cost of fuel up, and quite honestly, adding to the risk of transport. So it is an issue where fuel delivery by air, while it's possible, is not the preferable route here. So you're sitting in a situation where you have not only a community of 3,500, but all of the surrounding villages in the region rely on Nome for their backup. So they are at risk too. And without the fuel tanks being filled, what the community and what the region were looking at was a situation whereby about March, somewhere in March, depending on how harsh the winter was, they were going to run out of fuel. Well, if the January temperatures are any indication, where it's been below 20 degrees below zero, on average, Nome is usually about 2 degrees. It's been 20 below and colder for a long period of time. So you're going to go through that fuel pretty darn quick. And then what do? You're stuck until spring. And you're saying, well, April, March, isn't that spring? No, ladies and gentlemen, it's not. Because you can't get those fuel tanks refilled until the next fuel barge can come, which would then be when all of the ice is out of the Bering Sea, which puts you into May, June. Perhaps earlier if the ice moves, but that's your reality up north. So you've got a major community and outlying villages that are looking at a very, very real threat to their community. Right now, Senator Begich showed a picture on the floor. When I was in Nome last week, the price of regular fuel at the pump is $500, that's what it seems like to the people of Nome, $5.43 for regular. That's what they're paying today. Diesel is just a hair under, it's just less than $6. But that's what these people are paying right now. If they were having to fly in fuel for the balance of the winter, what they were looking at was about $9 a gallon. And this is on top of all of the other extraordinary costs that they pay as a community that is reliant on air for just about everything that they count on. So most of you, I think, may have seen the story in the news. Lots of people got to work to try to address the situation. I was in contact with the Coast Guard to see what they could do to help. The Coast Guard was amazing in saying, yes, we're committed to this mission. We're going to help the people of Nome. We're going to help the people of the region. And so what came together was a pretty interesting story. You've got a Russian fuel tanker, the Renda, who's home ported over in Russia. The Renda fills up with fuel in South Korea and was going to pick up fuel in Japan. They got shut out. They have to go to Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, on the Aleutian chain to fill up with about 400,000. They're basically trying to top off in Unalaska. But for those of us who know the federal laws and the Jones Act, you know you've got an issue there. So we had to get the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, Department of Energy in to get a Jones Act waiver so we can top off the Russian fuel tanker in an Alaska port so she can haul up north to deliver the fuel to the people of Nome. A pretty interesting saga just in describing the beginning. This is over a 1,000-mile nautical journey, and you're breaking ice for about half of the way. Well, the Renda is a pretty capable ship, but she's not an icebreaker. And so how she gets through that ice is the interesting part of the story. The Coast Guard cutter Healy, who has been on a research mission since early May and was on her way back to Seattle to deliver the crew after months of this mission, they get the call that Nome needs help. And the fine men and women of the Healy missed their Christmas, missed their New Year's, stayed on board to turn around, go back up, and be that escort for the Renda to clear a path to Nome. Now, I think it's important to just stop here and recognize that this is not the Coast Guard doing something for the people of Nome or the people of Alaska that is not part of the Coast Guard's mission. This month-long journey was the first fuel delivery through sea ice in Alaska's history, but it wasn't the first time that the Coast Guard has worked to get fuel to a community. And I think this is an important point. Back in 2000, Chief Warrant Officer Richard Glasgow testified about icebreaking operations on the Hudson River. At that time, there were 5 Coast Guard cutters that performed icebreaking duties from Sandy Hook, New Jersey, all the way up to Troy, New York. And what they were doing was they were working to get heating fuel to about 4 million people in the communities along the river there. And Officer Glasgow testified that as a direct result of the Coast Guard's continuous ice-breaking efforts that winter, all 274 petroleum-bearing barges that started the trip up the Hudson made it through the ice. And he also noted that if the Hudson had remained closed to barge traffic, it would have taken over 21,000 tank truck loads to move that petroleum, assuming that the trucks were available to make those deliveries. So you've got a situation where basically the Coast Guard comes to the rescue. They're saying, we can clear the path so that commerce can be facilitated, so these communities along the Hudson have the fuel, have the resources that they need. The Coast Guard made it happen in an efficient and an environmentally responsible way, avoiding 21,000 tank truck loads. Now, this is not unlike the role that the Coast Guard is played up in Alaska, but the difference here with Nome is there's not going to be 21,000 tank loads of petroleum because there's no road for those tankers. So we did not have that option for any other transport to the community short of air traffic. And so when we look about what the Coast Guard cutter Healy did and Captain Havlik, all the crew members, what they were doing was they were following in the footsteps of many members of the Coast Guard before him in carrying out the Coast Guard's stated ice operations mission, which is to assist vessels and communities in emergency situations and facilitate essential commercial maritime activities. In 2008, the Coast Guard carried out this mission by assisting with 680 ice transits, representing the transport of over $2 billion of cargo. Similarly, just last year, Coast Guard cutters coordinated with the Canadian Coast Guard ships to facilitate the movement of about $2 billion worth of critical goods on the Great Lakes. So, Mr. President, I point this out because I think it's important for people to know that in addition to all of the other critical missions that the Coast Guard has, one of theirs is to assist vessels and communities in emergency situations to facilitate essential commercial maritime activities. Getting fuel, an absolute bare necessity to the people in this northwestern region at a time when temperatures are 20 below for days and days on end. This was critical to us, and the Coast Guard did a remarkable job. And again, recognizing that these are men and women who gave up their Christmas holiday, who gave up their New Year's holiday to assist. They were really nothing short of remarkable. I had the opportunity to go on board the Healy when I was in Nome last week as the Renda was beginning to lay the hose from the fuel barge to the shore. And to be able to speak with the men and women who were exceptionally proud. But I told them, I said, you will go back home and your world will be changed because you will be able to stand up and say, yeah, I was on the Healy when we broke ice to get the Renda to help out the people of Northwest Alaska during a very difficult winter. Well, give you the update. They were able to successfully lay the hose. Oh, I should tell you this part of it. So the tanker gets in close to Nome after weeks of transit, and a difficult transit, because what was happening was with the conditions of the thick ice and the currents and the winds, there were days when they actually went backwards. That the Coast Guard cutter Healy would break the ice, loosen it up, but it was so cold and things were happening so fast that the ice would refreeze between the distance between the cutter and the Renda. In addition to some pretty tough environmental conditions, you've got a Coast Guard tanker that's leading a Coast Guard cutter leading a Russian tanker. We had some language issues going on. Had to translate all this. We had some cultural differences going on. But what they were able to facilitate, again, was pretty remarkable. And I'm giving laudatory praise to our Coast Guard, but I think it's also important to recognize the good work that the men of the Renda did in assisting as well. What they were able to do using NOAA satellites to determine where the best mapping could be, where to cut through that ice, they were able to break through and get within about a half a mile of the shore of Nome. It was close enough so that when I got off the Healy, I was able to take a snow machine to shore. It was about a 3-minute snow machine ride. That's how close they were able to get in safely to the shore. The Renda laid hose across the ice to connect to the tankers on shore. It was about a 6-day process to fuel it up, but they did it safely without any incident whatsoever. We're able to then close up that operation, and last Friday they took off from Nome to go back, the Renda to Russia and the Coast Guard Healy, cutter Healy to go back to Seattle. But that was Friday. I asked for the progress report just this afternoon. They're approximately 240 nautical miles southwest of Nome, 275 nautical miles from the ice edge. So they still have a long ways to go getting through the ice. And you would ask the question, well, why don't you just go back the way that you came in because you cut the trail? Doesn't work that way. It's cold up there. It's darn cold. And there's no more trail up there. In fact, what they're continuing to rely on are the NOAA satellites to, again, help them map out a perhaps more efficient way. But it has been tough. They've got very challenging ice conditions, very steady, strong winds. The weather's given them winds in excess of 25 to 30 knots, but hopefully they're going to be diminishing to 15 knots on Friday. They're working with NOAA and other folks to find really the safest, the most expedient route out of the ice. But the ice forecast continues to see ice edge expanding to the south. So all the progress that they're making going south the ice is just coming at them in the other direction. So it's challenging, but again, extraordinary professionals, and professionals across agencies. I've mentioned NOAA. I mentioned what we needed to do in order to facilitate the Jones Act waiver through Department of Energy, Homeland, DOD, but you also had the State Department that was involved. You had the EPA that was involved. You had the Native Corporation, Sitnasuk, that put this whole thing together. We had incredible local leadership coming out of the community of Nome. We had the University of Alaska researchers that helped with the UAVs to determine, again, how we best lay everything from the hose to making sure what the safest place is to cross the ice. An incredible, incredible act of collaboration. Mr. President, I see that my friend from Illinois is on the floor, and I know that I've gone over my time. I've got about 3 more minutes to wrap up, if I may, if that works with my colleague. And coming from a state that appreciates snow, I think that you would like to hear the rest of my story here, because I'm not done acknowledging the fine men and women of the Coast Guard. They also played a role in helping to dig out the community of Cordova a couple weeks ago. We've had some pretty tough snows. Cordova is a coastal community in South Central, and they got hammered. They got about 176 inches of snow. Last week, when we checked in, they had 16 feet of snow on the ground, which is pretty unusual. Not quite Valdez records, which is sitting at 27 feet right now. But it was enough that roofs were caving in, that there were public safety issues. And what the community did was come together, as small communities do, try to shovel out. But the Guard was there. 50 or 60 guardsmen were there. The Coast Guard came back. They were helping shovel. And it was really quite a lovely community story. But again, it's one of those that reminds us that sometimes when Mother Nature delivers us, whether it's winds and storms and cold in the north, or whether it's hurricanes in the south, that we come together as a people. We come together as communities to help. And sometimes we have some real heroes that emerge. And some of those heroes for us in Alaska these past few weeks have been our United States Coast Guard and our Alaska National Guards men and women. We, as I started my comments, we say that we do things bigger in Alaska, perhaps a little bolder. There's a new movie that's coming out that I'll go ahead. I'm going to put a plug on it. It's called The Big Miracle, and it's about the rescue of the whales back in the late 80s. Some of you may remember it. The whales were trapped up in the ice off of Point Barrow. And it's a wonderful story about how, as Alaskans, we came together working with the Russians, all agencies, environmental groups who would normally be in great opposition to oil development folks, all coming together for a common purpose to do good things. And that movie, Big Miracle, reminded me that in Alaska, we've got a few more big miracles that we can brag about, and it begins with people who really make the health and safety and the well-being of others their top priority, even when they don't know any of these people. I know that the people of Nome and Cordova and the people of Valdez all give thanks to those who have stepped up during these tough winter months to bail us out, shovel us out, but to be there at our side. So I thank you for the extra time that you have given me. I thank my colleague from Illinois for that. But again, extend my heartfelt thanks to our United States Coast Guard men and women, as well as the fine men and women of the Alaska National Guard. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.